Hello and welcome back. My name's Dave Anderson. One of the things that I wanted to discuss this morning was there's this idea that people in Straight Incorporated were in some kind of an experiment, that there was some kind of shenanigans, some kind of nefarious activities going on, that we were just test subjects, we were just pawns in somebody's great big game. I'm not real sure how I feel about that. I'm not sure that that's exactly accurate. What I am pretty damn sure of is that this, what Marcus Chatfield calls this technology that has been around for decades and decades and decades, hundreds of years. And we all act like we don't even know it. But what I've done is I dug up a document that was, excuse me while I put my glasses on here. I have to be able to see what I'm doing here, if you know what I mean. This is written by Albert D. Bitterman, M.A. He's from the Office of Social Science Programs, Air Force Personnel Training Research Center, Air Force Research and Development Command, Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. This was presented at a combined meeting of the section of Neurology and Psychiatry with the New York Neurology Society at the New York Academy of Medicine, November 13th, 1956, as part of a panel discussion on communist methods of interrogation and indoctrination. This report is based on work done under ARDC project number 7733 test 77314 in support of the Research and Development Program of the Air Force Personnel and Training Research Center, Lakeland Air Force Base, Texas. Permission is granted for the reproduction, translation, publication, use, disposal in whole and or in part, or for the United States government. And me too. Let me just read some of this as goes on. Maybe I can read the whole thing, I don't know. The United States has expended considerable amount of effort to get a full, accurate, meaning account of what happened to its personnel who were captured in Korea. I've been associated with these studies since their beginnings 3 years ago, because we believe the experiences of our returned prisoners of war can tell us much about the nature of a potential enemy, about the soldier, about the airman, about man, and generally, these studies are continuing. The 234 Air Force men who were returned by the Chinese Communists after the Korean armistice 2 years after, in the case of 15 of the men, about half of had some direct personal experience with communist attempts to extort false confessions. We know one airman died during such an attempt. There were many others. These attempts made against men, the reasons for these attempts, and the reaction of the men themselves comprise a very involved series of stories. Sounds familiar. The record of each of the long interviews conducted with these airmen after the return would engross you, I'm sure. Almost all are exciting stories of individual heroism and perseverance. Sounds familiar. This is an almost unmatched drama in the airmen's efforts to protect principles, dignity, and self-respect with their own inner resources to sustain them. A few of the stories do not have completely happy endings, and all of them reveal something about human imperfections. Our objective here is science, however, not drama. Therefore, I won't attempt, but in any event I could probably not do well. That is, to relate in the space of a few minutes the meanings of these experiences and to those who live through them. A few honest, discerning, and eloquent victims have accomplished this in a manner that social scientists need not and cannot match. As a social scientist, I find a singular interest of one result of the studies we and other groups have recently made of communist attempts to extort confessions. It is in the finding of our studies, which should be greeted as most new and spectacular, is the finding that essentially there was nothing new or spectacular about the events we studied. We found, as all other studies such as those of Hinkle and Wolff, that many human behaviors could be manipulated with a certain range of controlled environments. We found that the Chinese communists used methods of coercing behavior from men in their hands, which communists of other countries had employed for decades, which police and inquisitors had employed for centuries. The Chinese interrogators succeeded or failed to influence their behavior of their victims roughly to the event of the skill and the persistence of the personnel they employed matched to those of the practitioners in other places and at other times. While their initial attempts were generally inept, unsuccessful, their success tripled with experience. The reception of these findings has frequently been incredulous, and we have been asked, is there nothing more than to it than this? Can people be manipulated so easily? Are you sure that there was not something done that you failed to detect? In selecting the material I should discuss here, I have been influenced by these kinds of questions. Such a selection precludes discussing the useful hypothesis about human behavior in situations of stress, which other studies suggested. Briefly, here is our analysis of this problem. We found that we could not make a meaningful distinction between the measures that the communists took to render the prisoner as compliant, on the other hand, and on the other, those which sought to shape his compliance into very specific manners of confessor behavior, with which the world has become familiar. This distinction was suggested by the Chinese communist use of more or less identical methods by gaining compliance for a variety of different ends. For eliciting factual intelligence information, other forms of propaganda, collaboration, as well as false confession. In fact, prisoners met similar practices where no other objective could be discerned but compliance for its own sake. The methods of gaining compliance they used included nothing which was not common practice to police, intelligence interrogators of other times and nations, where restraints precluding such tactics were not enforced. Numerous historical examples existed where such practices produced behaviors as greatly at variance with principles, self-interest, and survival of the victim, as in any which occurred in North Korea or Communist China. The methods they used to shape compliance into the now familiar pattern of forced coercion, we believe, can be understood as essentially a teaching procedure. Teaching the prisoner how to comply. It was a complex teaching procedure, however. Its complexities were due to the elaborate and complex behavior which was sought, as well as to the fact that this behavior was so alien and offensive to the prisoner. It was further complicated by irrational aspects of the system within the communist interrogator operated. The system required him to teach without making his lessons explicit. That sounds familiar. I should point out that the distinction between including compliance and shaping compliance is purely an analytical division. The two kinds of methods are not independent of one another, nor separate in time. I would like to discuss first the measures used by the communists to include compliance, to undermine the resistance of the prisoner. The experiences of the American Air Force prisoners of the war in Korea, who were pressured for false confessions, enabled us to compile an outline of methods for eliciting compliance. Not much different, it turned out, from those reported by persons held by communists of other nations. I prepared a chart showing a condensed version of this outline. It shows our analysis of the techniques into 8 general measures, some illustrations of the specific forms these measures take, and our judgment of the effect of each. In inferring purpose from our judgment of the effects the measures have on the victim, it is likely to those who employ these measures conceive of them differently than we do. I have not included physical torture as a general category in the outline, despite the fact that many of our prisoners of war did encounter physical torture, and despite the fact that a few of the specific measures in the outline may involve physical pain, I have omitted torture from the outline to emphasize that inflicting physical pain is not a necessary nor a particularly effective method of inducing compliance. It's a real interesting chart here. You have the general methods, you have the effects, you have the purposes, and you have the different kind of variants of how this was worked out. The first one they listed was isolation. I think most straight survivors can definitely relate to that. And what the chart describes is it deprives the victim of all social support, of his ability to resist, develops an intense concern with the self, makes a victim dependent on the interrogator. It makes the person sitting in group dependent on the staff. Different variations of the way that works out is complete solitary confinement. Then you have complete isolation, semi-isolation, group isolation. All of these sound real familiar to a person who went through Straight Incorporated. Second thing they list is what they call monopolization of perception. And what this does is this fixes attention upon immediate predicament. What is happening right now? It fosters an introspection, a sense of, what's happening. It eliminates the stimuli competing with those controlled by the captator or the staff. I think it's captor, by the way, it's not captator, captor. Frustrates all actions not consistent with compliance. And some of the ways this is done about is through physical isolation, brightness or dark lights. Don't recall so much of that, just as much as being in a warehouse with the constant hum of incandescent light bulbs and fluorescent light bulbs, rather. A barren environment. Yeah, a warehouse, pretty much barren. Restricted movement. 12 hours a day in a warehouse. Monotonous food. Had plenty of that. Another thing that, another method that was used was induced deliberate, take two, induced deliberation and exhaustion. What this does is it weakens the mental and the physical ability to resist. You know, back to the monotonous food, we had the semi-starvation. We had exposure to, the heat and the cold in the warehouses because there was no air conditioning. There was no heater. We were exposed to those elements. Exploitation of wounds induced illnesses. The other day I was talking about the stifling heat in August in St. Petersburg, Florida, at the Morgan Yacht Building specifically. The heat was so intense. We're sitting in plastic chairs, and every straightling knows about the plastic chairs. But for those of you who don't, the ones that we sat in that particular summer were scooped. There was no ventilation in the back part. It was just a single scoop piece of plastic. And the stifling heat and the motivating and all of this stuff, you sweat. You sweat your ass off. And what happens with this sweat is the sweat gets in the bottom of that seat. Now you're sitting in your own sweat. It's not uncommon for a teenager, young man, I guess women too, but I know mostly about young men. Chalk itch. Terrible stuff. And I don't mean to make light of it. Myself, I had chalk itch from just above my knees to just below my ribs. For months, I was raw. These are the kinds of barren environments and that restricted movement, sitting 12 hours a day, will do for you. Another method that they used to bring about this exhaustion was sleep deprivation. 12 hours a day. You go home, you got 2-3 hours of writing moral inventories. You got 2 hours of your old comer coming over, reading over your moral inventories, and you got to say your prayers hours at night, and then somebody's got to cut a fart. There's always something going on. So meanwhile, you get 2 hours of sleep, you get up, do another 12-hour day, repeat the process. Total exhaustion. Another thing that used to keep us exhausted in between the groups, if you recall, straightlings will know this, is we had to sing songs. And I mentioned songs the other day. And one of the things about the songs was in between the groups. These were very intensive coercive groups. These were, in your face kind of shit. And they were 2.5 hours, something like that. Guess what came after the groups? A song. We sang songs, nursery songs, campfire songs, stupid songs. I think the songs were made to do a couple of different things. Number one, that they were meant to keep our minds mush. They did not allow us a chance to think, to rationally consider the garbage that we were just, force-fed. And now we have to sing Little Rabbit Foo-Foo or some bullshit like that. It just kept our brain without that ability to critically think. Not to mention that, of course, I was 14, 15, 16, 17 when I was in there, but you get a 17, 18-year-old and you have them singing Little Rabbit fucking Foo-Foo. This is going to embarrass, humiliate, belittle this individual to no end. That is exhausting. And that's probably one of the things that I've read about in Chinese camps, where they have a thing called the song all over the camps. Everybody's singing the same song all day. And it's just to keep the mind mush so you don't think. And that's why they did that. Prolonged constraint. We'll start off with 12 hours a day. That's one thing. But what happens if somebody starts cutting the fool and showing their ass? Well, they get slammed on the floor. They get slammed to the concrete. You got a guy holding one arm, got a guy holding another arm, a guy holding a leg, another guy holding the leg, somebody sitting on the chest, and somebody holding your head back. For hours and hours and hours. You could scream your bloody head off, and you were just going to be forced to lay right there. Interestingly enough, in this exhaustion of prolonged interrogation and forced writing. Moral inventories ring a bell. Did you have to write them? I know I did. That's called forced writing. Another thing that's on this example, or on this list here of the general methods used, are threats. This cultivates anxiety. This cultivates a sense of despair. What's going to happen next? I remember that feeling of sitting in the group minding my own business, and then all of a sudden the staff door, whoosh, would open up. The room would be dead silent. Everybody in that room praying that they don't hear their name called out. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. According to this, and this is going back to communist China and the Korean camps, threats of death, threats of repatriation, threats of endless isolation and interrogation, vague threats, threats against the family, mysterious changes of treatment. Yeah, hey, guess what? You're started over day one. Mysterious changes of treatment. Another method they used was occasional indulgences. And this is when somebody was doing particularly good, especially if they were being groomed. A lot of people were groomed to be on staff. And this provides a positive motivation for compliance to the program, essentially. And hinders adjustment to the deprivation, you know, and being forced in just such a degrading environment, all of a sudden to be asked to go outside to pick up trash. Fuck yeah, that was awesome. And pick up trash, it was a treat. You know, it kind of threw everything off. And some of these examples, you know, in addition to that one, are occasional favors. You know, the fluctuation in the interrogator's attitudes, or in our case, a difference in how staff treat us. Whether they sneered at us, whether they called on us, whether they looked for our opinions, or whether they just told us to stand up. Very temperamental sometimes, the staff were. And we always had the promises, you know, you always get promised this, you get promised that, you'll be out in 14 days. This is less than a year program. You're here because you want to. You can get out anytime you want. That's a lie. And you get rewarded, you know, for partial compliance. Yeah. Another thing was demonstrating omnipotence. All-powerful. The program. The building. The staff. Omnipotent. All-powerful. And what this does is, this is just a futility of resistance. There's nothing you can do with the building. You can't argue with the program. You're not allowed to go against the staff. You know? And the way that this was accomplished was through confrontations, and we used to call them come downs, you know, where it would just go on and on forever. And I'm not talking like 5-10 minutes. An example would be, I went through what they called the Christmas come downs in the Morgan Yacht Building in 1979. And these confrontations were called the Christmas come downs because they started on December 20th and they went on through December 26th. I can't tell you how many people were started over day one. It was an incredible thing. Terrible. Another thing that was used a lot, both in Korea, in the communist countries, and those camps, was degradation. Talk about making the cost of resistance appear more damaging to the self-esteem than not. You know, it's like if I don't, you know, comply, this is gonna last forever. You know, I've got to act. I've got to lie. You know, and the way that they would use this would be with our clothing. You know, with our the way we cut our hair. I wasn't allowed to. You know, I shave my head now, but I mean, at the time, I wasn't even allowed to have my hair parted down the middle. You know. The degradation went further than that. One of the few black people that we had in the Morgan Yacht Building, his name was Leon. And I remember Leon being made to sing "Pick a Bale of Cotton" in front of the whole room. The whole room. Pick a bale of cotton. One black child, a mighty white situation. Man, if the ACLU ever heard of that, they would have a fit. And they should. This is the kind of degrading stuff that just demoralized us and brought us further and further down. I'll continue reading here a little bit. While many of our people did not encounter physical violence, this rarely occurred as part of a systematic effort to elicit a false confession. Where physical violence was inflicted during this course of such an attempt, the attempt was particularly likely to fail completely. I should qualify my remarks on physical violence in two respects. First, the ever-present fear of violence in the mind of the prisoners appears to have played an important role in inducing compliance. Fucking A right it does. If you're under constant fear, if you don't know if you're going to be slammed against a wall, thrown on the floor, started over, you'll comply. You will comply. The communists generally fostered such fears through vague threats, the implication that they were prepared to do drastic things, and straight was prepared to do drastic things at any given time. Second, one form of torture was experienced by a considerable number of Air Force prisoners of war during efforts to coerce false confessions from them. The prisoners were required to stand or sit at attention for exceedingly long periods of time. In one extreme case, day and night, for a week at a time with only brief respites. In a few cases, the standing was aggravated by the extreme cold. This form of torture had several distinct advantages of extorting confessions. Folks, especially those of you who sat in group, hands on your knees, face forward. Only look at the person that's talking. 12 hours a day. You know how uncomfortable that is? Try sitting for 30 minutes in one position. That's uncomfortable. In a simple torture situation, the bamboo splinters technique, which is real popular in today's imagination, the contest is clearly one between the individual and the tormentor. Can he endure pain beyond the point to which the interrogator is willing to go through in inflicting the pain? Well, the answer for the interrogator is all too frequently, yes. They'll go further than you will. Where the individual is told to stand at attention for long periods, an intervening factor is introduced. The immediate source of pain is not the interrogator, but the victim himself. So right back to sitting in the chairs. It's not the staff that's creating all this problem. It's just you have to sit this way. And if you lean forward, somebody in the back is going to get a knuckle and it's going to go right up your fucking spine and make you sit up. You're going to want to turn around and slap the snot out of them. But you can't. Because you'll be thrown against the wall or thrown on the floor. It's the way it happened. Where the individual is told to stand at attention for long periods of time, an intervening factor is introduced. The contest becomes, between he and the tormentor, the staff. The motivational strength of the individual is likely to exhaust himself during this encounter. They wore us down by sitting us down. Bringing the subject to act against himself in this manner has additional advantages for the interrogator or the staff. As long as the subject remains standing, he is attributing to his captor to the power to do something worse to him. But there is actually no showdown of the ability of the interrogator to do so. Most frequently, although not invariably, the extent to which the interrogators in North Korea and China were willing or permitted to inflict physical punishment was actually very limited. Generally, it appears to have been limited to, quick cuff, slap, kick, sometimes merely threats and insults. Returnees who underwent long periods of standing and sitting, however, report no other experience to be more excruciating than sitting. No, nothing's worse than just sitting. For the interrogator, forced standing has still further advantages. It consists with a formal adherence to mythical principles of legality and humaneness important to the communists. These principles are important to the interrogation, particularly in facilitating the adoption of a positive attitude by the prisoner towards the interrogator. Gotta love the staff. The communists, furthermore, can gain a considerable propaganda advantage when victims who are released truthfully state that no one ever laid a hand on them. Didn't Straight love that? didn't we go to the outings or the speaking engagements? That's what they called them. And they like to show us off, is what they did. Kind of like the Chinese and the Koreans. The two attributes of constrained posture, as we have discussed, the active enlistment of the energies of the victims against himself, and the formal adherence by interrogators to twisted norms of humaneness and legality, apply also to other measures in the outline. These attributes help to account for the use and emphasis by the communists of certain techniques of undermining resistance and the neglect of de-emphasis of others. Techniques having these attributes are also consistent with other aspects of confession elicitation, namely the shaping of the prisoner's compliance into a very specific pattern of confessor-type behavior. Assuming the measures I have discussed have made the prisoner compliant, the problem remains of getting him to comply appropriately, of informing and instructing him as to the forms of compliance. In the case of false confession, this is a very complicated teaching job. The kind of confession we're discussing consists of considerably more than signing a piece of paper which says, oh yeah, on such and such date, I committed such and such a crime, signed David Anderson, whatever. It consists considerably more than making an equivalent oral statement in court. These confession extortion efforts involve the attempt to manipulate the individual so that he behaves over an extended period of time, as if, A, he actually committed certain concrete acts which can be described in meticulous detail. Yeah, I did that too. I lied through my teeth. Seemed like I would get further along if I lied. I lied so well I could get it down into minute details. For me to be honest, I had to lie. That's a little off-putting. These acts were criminal, and in the sense of being in violation of the most fundamental standards of human decency. Oh, we Australians were a bunch of pieces of shit, you bunch of druggies. That's exactly how we were taught. That's exactly what we were told. These acts were not isolated transgressions, but manifestations of a criminal pattern in his thought and actions. Not independent things. See, I only smoked pot. Before I went to straight, I smoked less than an ounce of pot my entire life. Alcohol, I had probably consumed less than a gallon my entire life. But these were manifestations of a criminal pattern in my thought and in my actions. So for less than an ounce of pot, for less than a gallon of alcohol, I got locked up for 3 fucking years. Okay. His crimes were part and parcel of a larger, nefarious political conspiracy. Folks, I went in January 21st, 1978. This was at the height of the drug war, the hoopla. This was right before Nancy Reagan said, just say no. This was when, shortly after, Nixon compared an all-out offensive on the drug war. And my parents got caught up into that. You know, they really saw this all-out offensive, this drug war, as being okay. And they bought onto it hook, line, and sinker. His criminal role was motivated by a self-seeking alignment with this political conspiracy, of which he was only a pawn. Yeah, I was guilty of being a teenager. That's probably the best way to put it. He also has to, in this point, show that he's remorseful and repentant. He's changed his attitude, and it's due to a newfound political conviction for which he is indebted to his current captors. And we didn't have a newfound political conviction. We had a newfound way that we had to survive, that we had to act, that we had to act as if. Let me continue. In this extreme form of confession elicitation, as encountered by our men, the objective was not merely having the prisoner conform that certain acts were committed, but rather to have his behavior confirm the entire worldview of the communist. The entire worldview of Straight Incorporated. Learning what behavior was being demanded, and even more, learning that the elaborate symbols and nuances through which this behavior had to be expressed to be acceptable. These were complex learning tasks indeed. The tasks were complexly difficult since the interrogator seldom made these demands explicit. Only by indirection was the prisoner generally made aware of the crimes of which he was accused. Yeah, I didn't know a lot of things were wrong until I was told they were wrong, and no, I was wrong. Poor interrogator had to use his own imagination and largely irrelevant events in his own life history to concoct an acceptable, detailed account of things which never happened. Moreover, his disposition had to jibe with the more or less independent invitation of the other prisoners or the other people that sat around him. I really could go on and on and on into this. But there's a few more pages that I'm going to skip. And I'm going to jump to the second chart. And this is called Responses to Demands for False Confessions, Resistance and Compliance. Now you have complete resistance. We know who you are, the complete resistance. Refuses to cooperate in any interrogation. Refuse to engage in any discussion with the interrogator or staff. Refuse to affirm or deny accusation and respond to implicit accusations. Ridicules exact accusation. Refuses to discuss them seriously. Responds with indignation to accusations. God, I wish I would have done that. Then you have what they call defensive resistance. You make a simple denial of the accusation. Hey, look, all I did was smoke a little pot and I drank a couple of beers. That's a simple denial of the accusation that I'm a drug addict at 14. Denies that the captor has moral or factual basis for making accusations. Hey, at 14, I did not have the wherewithal to do that. I didn't know what moral, factual basis were. I had no clue. Another defensive resistance is to make statements and depositions to prove my innocence. Well, I tried that, but it failed. Make a statement that suspicion was reasonable, the investigation was fair and justified, but I'm still going to protest my innocence. Start to falter a little bit here. Then they break it down into what they call defensive compliance. Make statements of possibility that the crime was unwillingly committed. It could have happened. Make statements of objective guilt. That means to say that the results were criminal or irrespective of the motives. Make ambiguous statements containing no explicit admissions, but which constitute a confession by the implication. Agrees to comply, but fails to carry through. Did that. Writes a confession, but refuses to sign it. Makes obviously unacceptable sabotage confessions. Makes a deposition with the obvious inconsistency, contradictions, indications that they were obtained through coercion. That's like me, a 14-year-old boy, talking about being pregnant. Just insane. Another idea of this defensive compliance is to accuse everybody else, but maintain my own innocence. Then we'll make incomplete confession, simple admission to acts without, going into specific details. We make a confession and it's convincing, without expressions of repentance and, that kind of thing. Active compliance. Confesses to criminal tendencies. Makes statements that has changed as he was a criminal and as if he had actually committed the alleged crime. Did that too. Makes subtly sabotaged confessions, blah, blah, blah. Complete compliance. Accepts the objective truth of guilt. Shows involuntary symptoms of remorse. Breaking down crying, sobbing, shaking, apologizing. And accepts the guilt. That's absolutely true. You're a druggie. Well, yes, I am. I guess I'm going to be a druggie all my life. Just because they said so. Makes behavioral changes indicative of complete identification and a commitment to the captor. This is like saying, hey, I'm straight. Straight Incorporated here helped me. What a great place Straight Incorporated is. Oh, what a bunch of crap. One of the reasons I wanted to bring this is because, like I said, when I went in, I had smoked less than an ounce pot. I consumed less than a gallon of alcohol. The first time I introduced myself in front of the group, as well as to the group of parents in an open meeting, it was my third day there. I went in on a Monday. I told them I did pot and alcohol. The following Friday, I had done pot, alcohol, hash oil, PCP, TCP, STP, MDF, NDA, BMF, horse tranquilizers. I did telephone poles. I did everything. You name it. Heroin, crack. Hadn't even done any crack, but I was smoking it. Anything. I was willing to tell any story. And in telling that lie, it was accepted as the truth. A lot of people got fucked up into that. I still messes with them to this paper. This paper is talking about, the communist methods and the North Korean methods. And I'm talking about Straight Incorporated methods. This was produced in September 1957. That was before I was born. I'm 57 years old. They knew this. There's no experiment. It's a continuation. We want you to behave this way. You're not going to act that way. We will make you act that way. This is nothing new. No experiment. This went on before the Korean conflict. It went on after the Korean conflict. It went on during Synanon. It went on during the Seed. It went on during Straight Incorporated. It went on with kids. It went on with Kids Helping Kids and every other spin-off splinter fucking group that there is. This information is not new, but it's being used on kids. That's horrible enough. Think about what that kid's going to be like 40 years from now because of it. And that, my friend, is why we're here to tell the story. Once again, I appreciate you for listening.